How did the Chinese language have to adapt to modern technology? Jing Su will be here to talk about her new book, Kingdom of Characters, The Language Revolution That Made China Modern. What does it feel like to lose one loved one and gain another at the same time? Catherine Schulz will join us to talk about her memoir, Lost and Found. Liz Harris will be here to talk about what's going on in the publishing world. Plus, my colleagues and I will talk about what we're reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's January 21st. I'm Pamela Paul. Jing Su joins us now from New York. She is a professor of East Asian languages and literature and comparative literature at Yale, where she specializes in Chinese literature, history, culture, science, and technology, and politics. And her new book is called Kingdom of Characters, The Language Revolution That Made China Modern. Jing, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Pamela. Happy to be here.
So give us a grounding, if you will, in the Chinese language. Obviously, Mandarin is the main dialect, but how much variety is there within China?
There are hundreds of dialects, and they're all grouped under these big, what's called topolect groups. So for instance, Mandarin is actually only part of the northern topolect group. Down in the south, if you're in Hong Kong, you're part of what's called the Yue topolect group. But if you cross over to Taiwan, you get another big southern dialect group called Ming. So there's these several large chunks of language plates, so to speak. And then within those places, all these different subsidiaries of dialects and local languages.
And do they all share the same written language?
That is exactly what has astonished outsiders, foreign travelers to China for centuries, is that this massive land with all these different people speaking different dialects were actually united and could communicate via the written medium.
Tell us about that written medium. How did it evolve? What is the scope of the character system of Chinese in all its dialects?
The earliest writing evidence we have in Chinese actually comes from oracle bones, which were usually etched onto, or actually singed onto tortoise shells or ox scapula, kind of like your shoulder blades, because it's nice and flat. And they were used mostly for divination purposes. And later on, so Chinese writing also evolved in part constrained and enabled by what surface you wrote it on. So for instance, if you send something to bone, it's a little complicated, and so you have to go with very succinct and economize on the kind of characters you can write. So we have very simple characters in this early times. But then if you move on to bronze vessels and bamboo slips, then you have to kind of like make very solid the lines, right, on bamboo slip. And then with bronze vessels where it's a little softer, you can use it because you do it in clay molds first. Then you can make sort of curvature. So eventually, through various standardizations, Chinese character evolved into what we see today. But it's still remarkably similar to its origins, and it's become just a little bit more square.
And what's the time period you're talking about with that the bone etching, for example?
3000 BCE. So this is Chinese writing has been around for a long time. And except these earliest evidence weren't really discovered till early 20th century.
And how does that compare with writing in the West in terms of the time period?
Well, the Phoenician alphabet is quite different. And until the Greeks took it over, it too was ideographic. And the idea was that, all writing systems, and linguists will agree with this, started pictorial. So, the way we think of Chinese today, we think of it more as, it's kind of like pictographs. So that's the oldest conception. But Phoenician alphabet as well were done in sort of pictographic way until the Greeks took it over. Then it kind of evolved into the phonetic alphabet we know today.
This written language now, the character-based language, roughly how many characters are there in the entirety of the Chinese language, and then that are used most frequently, the base?
The entirety, we have about 80,000 so far. And of course, new or different characters are still being excavated as people dig up, artifacts, etc. But in terms of literacy, like what you would actually need to read newspapers and for everyday function, it's about 3,000 to 4,000 characters. So it's not horrible.
And how do new characters come about? Like in France, for example, we know that we have the Académie Française, which will dictate what words that float in can kind of stay there and which ones need to be Frenchified before they're part of the language. But there's a system in place to write any of that. How do you actually, when a new word enters into Chinese, who determines what the character is going to be?
Well, it doesn't quite work in the same way in Chinese. The biggest issue now is actually how to consolidate all these different kinds of Chinese script. Because what I mean by that is the Chinese language was the lingua franca of East Asia plus Vietnam for quite a few centuries before China encountered the West and its languages. So at the time, Chinese language character writing was actually taken over and sort of traveled to various places. And for instance, in Japan, Korea, even Vietnam. And gradually, it sort of took root in those contexts and evolved a little bit differently. So if you take a character, for instance, to read, it actually looks quite different in Japanese than it does in Chinese, what you see in mainland China, even though the two characters mean the same thing. So, in the digital era, you really have to put characters into computer codes and put them in a standardized way so that, let's say, if you email a friend from Paris to Taipei, you want it to show up consistently. So that's actually the big work now, is try to basically take stock and try to consolidate and streamline the kind of Chinese characters out there, because there are many characters that have different variants.
All right, we've jumped about 120 years ahead in the sort of timeline of your book. Let's talk about earlier technologies, because that all sounds quite daunting, but so does the idea of, a telegraph or even a typewriter. So let's talk about the beginnings of the process of figuring out how to adapt Chinese script to technology. When did that all start and how?
So the story of the Chinese script revolution and how it came to modernize it's a story about China and the West. Because without the Jesuit missionaries first coming to China in the 16th century and trying to understand what the Chinese language was, the Chinese didn't really see their language any differently than the way they've always seen it. And so what happened was, as these Western technologies came in together with imperialism and colonial dominance, China had to confront the fact that it had to either play the game or be completely shut out. So this began a long process, an arduous process of how to get itself into the infrastructure of global communications technology, right? Because telegraphy in the 19th century, that was the internet of the 19th century. And Chinese didn't really have a way of getting in on that, because you think about telegraphs. Back then, you send them in Morse codes. That is to say, combinations of dashes and dots to represent 26 letters of the Western alphabet, plus a number of other combinations for numbers 0 to 9. So if you couldn't send a telegram in alphabet letters, you basically cannot partake in the benefits and the modernization of that technology. So that was a big deal for China. But at the time, one has to say, China also didn't jump on it fast enough, because it had just come out of the Opium War, where Westerners first brought opium at its gates. It had just come out of a series of internal uprisings and unrest. It was very wary and quite suspicious of anything that was foreign. So when Russia actually first came to China and tried to peddle telegraphy, the answer was, no, thank you. We have good men on horseback who do the job just fine. Because they were afraid, and you know this from internal documents and discussions, that if they let one Western country in the door, the others will surely follow, just as they did in the aftermath of the Opium War. But the problem was, the big telegraph magnates, actually the Danes were dominant in this industry. They wanted to get into the Chinese market so much that they decided they would do this regardless, with or without China's consent. So there's a story that I talk about in chapter 3, where on a moonless night, they basically secretly snuck onto Chinese territory, laid down the cables, and was done by dawn. And so without getting permission and without any kind of resistance, they managed to lay the first cables just like that.
Who on the Chinese side was instrumental in finally getting China to welcome or at least accept this form of technology?
There was a lot of internal discussion, kind of like the way there have been in recent times or throughout the 20th century. There's a camp that wants to westernize. The more progressive thinkers who think this is the way we have to take a detour through westernization because we cannot create these technologies on our own. And besides, they have the first mover advantage. And this is a theme that recurs over and over again in history of technology in general. Like if you're the first to build a certain technological infrastructure, it's kind of like putting something in the groundwater. No one who comes after you can afford to ignore what you've done. So they basically have to come to terms with it. And that's part of the discussion internal to Chinese officials and diplomats and so on and so forth. But then there's the other camp who is very wary and skeptical and feel that Chinese tradition should be able to stand on its own. That even if now momentarily we have to rely on westernization, that they cannot forget that Chinese learning is actually key and still the main core.
So at what point, without maybe getting too technical, because it's hard to imagine how it was done, how did the telegraph work in Chinese?
Well, essentially what had to be done was that they sent Chinese telegrams in numbers, in 4-digit strings. And this was not exactly China's decision because the Danes basically, in order to facilitate their business in China, they actually came up with the first telegraphic code for the Chinese language, not the Chinese themselves. So it was a moment and an opportunity missed. But about 50 years after that, this decision was overturned and China began gradually throughout the arduous 20th century with nationalism and ideas about self-building and strengthening. They gradually clawed back that advantage bit by bit. And the reason I like this story is because you either hear China good story or China bad story. But I think this particular history about global technology is actually a story about cooperation and rivalry. And involved both Chinese and Westerners alike. Because believe it or not, modernizing the Chinese language was not just a Chinese affair.
Almost as impossible, or maybe even more impossible to imagine, is how did the Chinese script get adapted to typewriting?
It took extraordinary engineering feat, but there was also division within that, right? Because if you think about the typewriter, we all still use a keyboard. It's the legacy of QWERTY. But if you look at QWERTY, it's really just a keyboard for 26 letters, right? Plus some for control codes and whatnot. But for Chinese, the first thought is, wow, we have to make a giant keyboard. I mean, a room size to accommodate, let's say, 80,000 characters. So they did several things. First, they really scrutinized the Chinese language as a whole inventory and looked at, well, what characters are really used for literacy? Then they tried to map that onto an alphabetic keyboard. And long story short, eventually the way they did it was actually by not using any alphabet letters. They essentially had to look inside the Chinese language and try to figure out what is an inherent modular logic in Chinese character writing that rivals the alphabetic logic. And by that, I mean, when you look at the alphabet, Western alphabet, and we don't really think about this, it has some true advantages and some real power in this writing system because you only have to deal with 26 units, right? 26 letters, and you can compose any word out of that. But for Chinese, that was very difficult. And they also didn't have the other advantage, which is very important, is the internal successive logic, right? You can use the alphabet to order things. So in other words, B never comes before A, D never comes before C, so on and so forth. So there's a very distinct succession, a kind of very powerful ordering that you can use to apply to other things. Think of how many things that we order using the alphabet, right? We say ABCs, go to a phone book, a directory, so on and so forth. For Chinese characters, not so much. So the big innovation was for them to figure out how to tap into their own alphabetic powers without using the Western alphabet.
Well, how do they do it? How many keys are there? How does that work?
Well, what they did was they looked inside a Chinese character and basically decomposed it into units, these modular units. Now, I'll explain that a little bit. When you look at a Chinese character, it's very clear that it's kind of squarish, right? It's very complicated. But if you look inside, it's actually composed of parts. Now, these parts are not equal to letters, right? English letters. They're really kind of clusters of strokes, right? A stroke is just kind of a line and anything that you can make a dot or a line. And they come together in these smaller components. And it turns out, Chinese is kind of like Lego, is you can build it up using this module units. And each character has between 2 to 4 of these components. So what's interesting is if you then take these components and map them onto a keyboard, the way you would type a Chinese character, any character will only take between 2 to 4 keystrokes. Now, the average English word is a bit over 5. So it takes about, between 4 and 5 strokes on the keyboard to make an English word. So what the Chinese did was basically taking over the alphabetic logic, try to figure out how they could correspond to it and use it to modernize and to enhance their technological power. And it's hard to imagine that now, but modernizing the Chinese script, getting into this particular mode of modularity was the door that opened all doors. If you think about it, there's nothing that you can do on the internet without having to use language somehow, right? If your language does not exist in cyberspace, you basically can't use it to communicate. You can't use it to track anything. You basically can't use it at all. It would not have a life beyond what you can write on paper, which can get lost. Writing is also greatly inaccurate, depends on handwriting. So, modernizing the Chinese script was really kind of like disciplining it for the technological age.
It's interesting when you talk about the units for the written character. It seems like it's analogous in a way to, say, the way in which a German word is made, not in terms of the characters, obviously, because it's an alphabet, but the way you have these very long German words, because there are lots of different words put together to create this one long and often terrifying word.
Yes, and having learned German myself, I understand the terror. And I think that's actually kind of a good analogy, except, a Chinese character, unlike Western word, does not have a root. That is to say, you don't add things to it to change the tense, because Chinese characters actually don't have tenses. They basically use another character, add another character to tell you whether this action had happened or is about to happen or is happening now. And so that's why the Chinese script was also a tremendous challenge for Westerner technology people who wanted to, let's say, sell telegraphy to the Chinese or sell computers to the Chinese, because it was like the ultimate litmus test to any claims of technological universality in the West. Because in order to make, let's say, the internet or computing or technology truly universal, right? I mean, partly for profit, reasons of profit, not just altruism. They had to make sure that they can actually conquer or penetrate or somehow assimilate this odd example out there in the world, which is the Chinese language.
Let's talk about tones, because Chinese is a tonal language. And in Thai, for example, which is also a tonal language and has 5 tones, when you have a different word in a different tone, there isn't a tone marking for it. The spelling changes because there's an alphabet of 76 letters in Thai. How does that work in Chinese? And then how do you get across things like tone and type and in modern technology, for example, like Siri?
Yes, that's actually a great question, because one of the biggest trade-offs of representing Chinese in Roman letters in Western alphabet was that it could not really represent tones. Now, one of the hallmarks of Chinese language is that there's a lot of homophones or characters that are pronounced exactly the same, even though they look different. In fact, the way that a Chinese speaker can tell what characters meant when they're talking to you is because they can discern from the context which characters meant. So if you think of my name, Jing. So in Chinese, it's actually a character for peace or quiet, and it's a 4th tone, or it's a down tone. But there's also Jing, 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 Jing. So you hear there's a little modulation in what I'm saying, but each of those tone has several characters of that tone, not just one. So when they Romanized Chinese, there was actually a big argument for and against Romanization, was that how much they were losing. Because the Chinese character itself, if you look at it, because of its complex structure, you can tell immediately which characters meant and what it should be pronounced as. But if you squeeze 80,000 characters into a representation of only 26 letters, it is much harder and you lose so much specificity in that process.
Talk about that, the process of Romanizing Chinese, the development of pinyin, and what role Mao played in the process of modernizing the Chinese written language.
When you look at romanization now, we basically go by the international standard set by mainland China called Pinyin, P-I-N-Y-I-N, which has been in place since the 50s and 60s. But before this standardization process, it was really like a wild, wild west for a century or so, where Chinese was being romanized in whichever way you can imagine. And the reason for that was it was first romanized by Western missionaries who, they were dispatched to the most remote regions in China. And to be able to assimilate and to communicate with the locals, they basically came up with ways of transcribing what they were saying so that they can kind of emulate and start communicating with them orally. But depending on where you were in China, you basically heard a different dialect. So the problem was all these early romanizations were basically transcribing these local languages that no one outside could really understand. And apart from that, you also have the problem of the English missionaries, the French missionaries, the German missionaries. Right. They all had their own system of romanizing as well, so they could hardly communicate with one another. And I remember going to the Vatican Library, tracking down the first bilingual Chinese Western language dictionaries. And I was looking at these systems, like the French missionaries, and their manuscripts in the National Library in Paris was totally different from what I was seeing in the British Library or in the Vatican Library. So you can imagine the chaotic time at the time for the West, for the Europeans to even understand China. And I think no wonder the Chinese language seemed very confusing to them because their own systems were very confusing.
You have a chapter called When Peking Became Beijing, which was probably the most noticeable change for people of a certain generation. Or when you look at old maps, of course, you see things in that older system. How and when and why did that change happen?
Well, that really came after, by that time, it's like 70, 80 years of trying very aggressively to try to modernize Chinese. In the 1950s, there's also the political change, right? The communists came to power. It was the first time China was actually unified since it became a nation. And thus began the project of a national language system. And at that time, communist China realized how important it was to internationalize. And they wanted very much also to reverse this history, this long history of very confusing ways of saying Chinese names, pronouncing the names of places and things. They wanted to somehow correct that. And they wanted to, in many ways, claim Romanization for the Chinese. Because if you think about the earlier systems, for instance, Wade Giles, which was devised by Thomas Wade, a British diplomat, and Herbert Giles, who was a colleague of his, they came up with a system that was in place for a long time. And for decades, Chinese found it very awkward to use because it was really designed to accommodate Western listening habits, not Chinese. So Chinese found themselves have to pronounce their own names and just speaking their own language through these really kind of distorted tones and awkward diacritics and spellings. So Pinyin was basically built on all these precedents from the late 19th century on. So the language reformers who were in charge of devising Pinyin, this small committee that I talked about that basically worked day and night around this project, they consulted all the different Romanization proposals that came before, including the missionaries, including the Chinese schemes that the reformers came up with themselves. And they consolidated them into one scheme that they think was fair and representative, a compromise among all the different spoken dialects, foreign systems of understanding Chinese, and so on.
All right, I'm skipping way ahead, but final question. What are the big challenges now, with voice recognition and texting and transcribing, and then the differences throughout the Chinese diaspora in terms of dialect? What is the current state of things?
What you're seeing now is because of this initial entry into the digital world, the Chinese language is now able to do a lot more. Even just a year ago, there's a great competition between Baidu and Google and other companies who are trying to basically come up with ways of translating languages. We all use Google Translate. So what could capture the Chinese most accurately in automatic or machine translation, right? How would you utilize it in the most efficient way possible? And how do you propagate it? How do you in some ways make Chinese easier to learn? These are all at the forefront of AI, 5G, so on and so forth. So in some ways, we're only seeing the beginning of what digitized Chinese can do.
All right. Well, there is so much more history in here. We've skipped through entire decades and technologies, but readers can discover them for themselves. The book, again, is called Kingdom of Characters, The Language Revolution That Made China Modern by Jing Su. Jing, thank you again for being here.
Thank you so much, Pamela.
Catherine Schulz joins us now from the Eastern Shore of Maryland. Her new book is called Lost and Found. Catherine, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
So this is your second book, but before we get into it, I just want you to talk for a moment about your first book. The title alone, of course, is evergreen, but I feel like it's always something that people should think about. And didn't Drew Faust once assign it for all incoming Harvard students to read? For those who haven't read it, it's called Being Wrong. Tell us a little bit about that.
That is a book that's about our relationship to error. It's about both how we think about being wrong and then, of course, how it actually feels to be wrong, or more specifically, how it feels to realize that we're wrong. And, it's interesting. You're right that it's an evergreen book. That book came out in 2010. I have sometimes thought that I should have published it with a new foreword in 2016, when a lot of the country was grappling with how it felt to be radically wrong about a great number of things. But I think that's kind of the human condition. We're always grappling with how it feels to be wrong about things.
And what did you want to get at in that book, given that we're all feeling wrong or should feel wrong or are wrong most of the time?
It has a couple of things in common with my current book. And one of them is that I think what motivated me to write it was a sense of real humility in the face of the endless mysteries of the world and the cosmos and other people. So I suppose what I wanted people to get out of it, to the extent that I think that way about my books, is just an enduring reminder that our knowledge of everything, including one another, is always limited, and that it's good to be a little cautious and a little humble in the face of that.
That's like a very radical and unusual idea right now, Catherine. A good one to bear in mind. When you finished writing that book, did you immediately start thinking, okay, what's next? What's the next book?
Oh, not at all. I mean, there's a reason there's a decade plus gap between the two books. I love to write, but I'm a slow writer, and I'm also quite picky. Even at article length, I'm very careful about what I decide to take on, partly because I am slow, but partly because I do have to be pretty passionate about whatever I'm writing to feel like I can do a good job with it. So no, I had no sense of, I know what's next and I'm turning to it. And in fact, it took a very long time for an idea to come along that made me say, yes, I definitely want to write that.
Well, since you brought up writing articles, I want to mention a couple of them that you've done for The New Yorker. They're often about subjects that I find fascinating, but also scare the hell out of me. And two, in particular, you did one on stink bugs and one on earthquakes. And I just have to wonder how you find your subjects. What is it that drives you to pursue something as a writer?
Well, the stink bugs unfortunately found me. As you said, I live on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, and before that I lived up in the Hudson Valley, and both of those places turn out to be epicenters of the brown marmorated stink bug invasion. So, it's funny, at a certain point, it's kind of a good thing about being a writer. You can turn even the literal pestilence of your life into something worthwhile. At some point after, escorting my 7,000th stink bug out of the house, I thought, what even are these creatures, and why are they suddenly all around us, and what kind of threat do they pose? So that's how the stink bug story came about. The earthquake piece, I lived in Portland for a while, and I have family out there, and I'm very attached to the region, the Northwest in general. And I was having dinner with a friend out there who at the time was a member of the Portland City Council, and he absolutely in passing said something like, none of it's going to matter when the earthquake comes along and just flattens all of us. And I had no idea what he was talking about. And considering that I did live out there and I care about the region and also read a lot of media and, as it happens, love geology, I thought, boy, if I don't know about this epic seismic risk out here, then probably not nearly as many people know about it as they should. So I started digging into it.
And now everyone knows and is scared. It's funny. I remember we've known each other for a number of years. And I remember when you were leaving New York Magazine, where you were the book critic, and going over to the New Yorker, you were talking about the things that you like to write about. And you said that generally science at the time. And these two pieces, although very different subjects, stink bugs and earthquakes, are both about, they're both scientific subjects in one way or another. What is it about those subjects? Like if you had to tie them together, like what is it that makes a subject not just interesting to you personally, but something you really want to spend that time writing, since you are, as you say, a slow writer?
I suppose it's connected to what I said earlier about this kind of awe at the mysteries that the world confronts us with and the cosmos confronts us with. I do find the natural world boundlessly interesting, and I find that it rewards our attention and our curiosity. Like the longer you pay attention to it, the stranger it gets, and the more there is to say about it. So I suppose it's just, for whatever reason, it's what catches my eye. I love people. I love to write about people too. A couple of my favorite stories I've ever written are about individual human beings, and yet very often I find that when I really want to dig into a subject, it's earthquakes or it's wildfire or it's stink bugs.
Okay, with this book, it started also with an essay, and that essay was about losing things. Talk about that.
This book grew out of a piece I wrote in 2017 for The New Yorker that was, it was an elegy for my father, but it was a very strange kind of elegy because, as you say, it wasn't just about losing my dad. It was about the whole broader category of all the things we lose, keys, wallets, cell phones, elections, you name it. And at the time, I didn't really have any idea of expanding it into the book, but it was really satisfying both intellectually and emotionally to place my father's death in the context of this kind of large exploration of losing all kinds of things. And so the moment that I thought, oh, well, there's this kind of mirror image experience, which is the category of discovery and all the things we find and why that's actually, unlike losing, so pleasurable and so interesting. And at the heart of that, there's the best thing I've ever found, which is my partner. And I thought, okay, well, now there's kind of the beginnings of a book emerging from this.
So you knew that it would be a book pretty early on then?
Not after I finished the article. And to be honest, not even quite in the moment when I realized there was this mirror image idea of finding. Actually, what happened is I was talking to my partner. We were on a road trip in the middle of the night in the absolute middle of nowhere, Alabama, and talking about the possibility of this pair of stories, a diptych that's losing my father and losing things in general, and then finding my partner and finding and discovery in general. And that was interesting to me, but still didn't feel like, this is a book. And then in the course of that conversation, my partner happened to use this phrase, lost and found. And the mind at 2 a.m. is a very strange thing. And what happened is I absolutely, in a kind of resounding way, heard the word and, like the little connection between those. And I had the kind of interesting experience of falling in love and losing my father in quick succession. So I had been thinking a lot about the way that we're very often, in adulthood, experiencing more than one thing at once and feeling more than one emotion at once. And the moment that I had the thought of, well, there's actually this third category to explore, which is the conjunction and contradiction of feelings that defines our lives so often. That was actually the moment when I said, okay, it's not a diptych, it's a triptych, and it is absolutely a book I want to write.
And the triptych is and.
That's right. So the book is in 3 parts. The first is lost, the second is found, and that final section is called and.
I'm going to leave the and for readers to discover. Let's start with Lost. Would you read for us from the very beginning of the book?
Sure, I'd be honored to. I have always disliked euphemisms for dying. Passed away, gone home, no longer with us, departed. Although language like this is well-intentioned, it has never brought me any solace. In the name of tact, it turns away from death's shocking bluntness. In the name of comfort, it chooses the safe and familiar over the beautiful or evocative. To me, all this feels evasive, like a verbal averting of the eyes. But death is so impossible to avoid, that is the basic bedrock fact of it, that trying to talk around it seems misguided. As the poet Robert Lowell wrote, why not say what happened? Yet there is one exception to this preference of mine. I lost my father. He had barely been dead 10 days when I first heard myself use that expression. I was home again by then, after the long, unmoored weeks by his side in the hospital, after the death, after the memorial service, thrust back into a life that looked exactly as it had before I left, orderly and daylit, its mundane obligations rendered exhausting by grief. My phone was lodged between my shoulder and my chin. Well, my father had been in a cardiac unit, and then an intensive care unit, and then in hospice care, dying. I had received a series of automated messages from the magazine where I work, informing me that I would be locked out of my email if I did not change my password. These arrived with clockwork regularity, reminding me that my access would expire in 10 days, in 9 days, in 8 days, in 7 days. It is remarkable how the ordinary and the existential are always stuck together, like the pages in a book so time-worn that the print has transferred from one to the other. I did not fix the password problem. I did lose the access, and with it, any means to solve the problem on my own. And so, after my father died, I found myself on the phone with a customer service representative, explaining, although it was absolutely unnecessary to do so, why I had neglected to address the issue in a timely fashion. I lost my father last week, perhaps because I was still in those early, distorted days of mourning, when so much of the familiar world feels alien and inaccessible. I was struck, as I had never been before, by the strangeness of that phrase. Obviously, my father hadn't wandered away from me like a toddler at a picnic, or vanished like an important document in a messy office. And yet, unlike other oblique ways of talking about death, this one did not seem cagey or empty. It seemed plain, plaintive, and lonely, like grief itself. From the first time I said it, that day on the phone, it felt like something I could use, as one uses a shovel or a bell pull, cold and ringing, containing within it both something desperate and something resigned, accurate to the confusion and desolation of bereavement.
Thank you. Was the book that you ended up writing the one that you set out thinking it would be? Did it change along the way?
It is, I think, the closest I could come to the book I wanted to write. And I say that with reservations only because my feeling about all of writing is, there's this platonic form of the book you want to write in your head, and it's beautiful and perfect and polished, and it says everything exactly right. And then you sit down to put that platonic form on the page, and it's just hopeless, right? I mean, the gap between what you want to do and what you are able to do is always enormous, and the struggle of the writer is to close it to the best of your abilities. But I, kind of unusually for me, I did have a very clear sense of this book from the beginning. I understood its overall structure. I understood emotionally and for the most part intellectually what I wanted it to do. So there were a lot of micro struggles. I had no idea how to start. It's funny you had me read the beginning. It took me forever to figure out how to get into this book. Inevitably, some stuff moved around, some stuff wound up on the cutting room floor, but I was always approximating an image I had from the beginning.
How did you land on this beginning?
Effortfully. Attrition. None of the others worked. There was a version of this that opened with me as a little kid with my father reading bedtime stories to my sister and me. There's somewhere in my enormous outtakes file, there's a 10,000 word opening about Malaysia Airlines 370, the airplane that tragically went missing with everyone on board some years ago. So I really did try, loss is a really big category, and that was what was interesting to me and what felt compelling to write about it. But it also meant there were, there's a lot of different kinds of losses and scales of losses. So I just kept, circling around it, kind of pulling at things, hoping they were the doorknob to let me in. And finally I went with the straightforward, which is this section of the book is about the death of my father. And I should just walk in the obvious door.
As you said, loss is a huge subject, and there are lots of books about it, and grief, particularly recently, it seems. It feels like somehow we're landing on this subject of sad things, or maybe it's just that there are several of us at the book review who gravitate towards that subject. Were there books about grief and loss that you thought, well, my book could be like this, or at least that were models of what the kind of thing you wanted to achieve?
I don't know that there were models per se, but there were books that I was very happy to have in my mind as I thought about how to write my own. I guess a couple of those, I have said in print what an enormous admirer I am of Helen Macdonald's H is for Hawk, a truly beautiful and unusual book about her grief over her father's death. I really admired Chimamanda's book, Notes on Grief, about the death of her father, partly because it's also a really loving relationship between a father and a daughter. I was devastated by Wave, by Fun Home. I mean, I could go on, Lament for a Son. But I think if there's one book that this book is sort of obliquely in conversation with, it's probably C.S. Lewis's A Grief Observed, which is about the death of a partner, not the death of a parent, and which is a profoundly Christian reckoning with grief. And I think that's part of why I found myself feeling a little bit in conversation with it, because I find Lewis to be a spectacularly clear-eyed and devastating amanuensis of grief. He just sits there and writes it down for you. And yet I do not share his ground floor, right? I'm not a devout Christian wrestling with grief. And I felt the need for a kind of secular response to that, as it were.
So for listeners frantically taking notes about some of those books, Wave is Sonali Dharaniagala, and the book by Chimamanda, it's Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Not that there are many authors named Chimamanda, but just in case. You said that C.S. Lewis is a devout Christian, and that actually kind of naturally brings me to your wife, who is also Christian, different religious background from you. And she's also a writer like you, and she figures enormously into this book. How did you handle that, writing about another writer who is also your wife? And was any of that tricky?
To be honest, it was by far the most delightful part of the book to write. I mean, you should have her back on the podcast. My partner is Casey Sepp, my fellow New Yorker staff writer and author of Furious Hours, a book about Harper Lee. And the truth is, poor Casey, there was no indication when she met me or when she married me that I was going to go off and write a memoir. It's quite far afield from anything I've done. And she is a more private person than I am. And it speaks volumes for her that she championed this book from the very beginning and just sort of gave over not only her life, but to be honest, her family's life. There's quite a lot about her parents, my in-laws, in this book as well. And it was fun. I mean, it turns out writing about love is really, really fun. And, when I was working on the found section, I would sit and write during the day. And then every evening I would bring the pages up to her and read them to her at bedtime. And they felt like bedtime stories and they felt really delightful. And, I think she had kind of one evening when she said, "Oh, what did you write today?" And I said, I wrote about this fight we once had. And I saw her for the only time in the entire course of working on the book. I did see her kind of blanch slightly. But as it turns out, she really loves that fight scene. And it's pretty funny. And I think she understood right away why it needed to be in the book.
In the acknowledgments, you say that writing about Casey was the easiest and most pleasurable part of writing the book, which fascinated me because some people find love very hard to write about. What for you was the hardest part about working on this book?
I think it probably was the opening, as I was describing earlier. I struggled. Opening pages feel, rightly or wrongly, like they carry an extra burden. You really do have to bring people in, and you have so much you sort of want to say all at once, and you have to figure out how to do it in order because people read in order. And so that was quite challenging. And I think the other thing that was tricky throughout the book was finding the right balance between these very personal stories I'm telling, which really do unfold like stories, and then the more meditative parts of the book when I'm walking readers through the category of loss or through the category of finding and discovery or through this really strange and interesting category of andness, of what it's like to live with conflicting experiences or multiple experiences and multiple emotions. So it wasn't that either piece was hard. I love to write about ideas, and that feels like, per my last book about being wrong, it feels like familiar terrain to kind of wrestle with these abstract categories of human experience. And I loved and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to have written about my father and Casey, two of the people I love most on this planet. So individually, they were not hard, but figuring out how to make sure they sat comfortably beside each other and flowed naturally one to the next without this kind of jarring whiplash for readers of like, am I in a memoir? Am I in some kind of philosophical meditation? What's going on here? That was probably, after the opening, the trickiest part of the book.
All right. Well, since you mentioned the word meditation, and earlier on you mentioned Helen MacDonald's H is for Hawk, I'm going to end here with a quote that Helen gave to this book. She writes, "This is an extraordinary gift of a book, a tender, searching meditation on love and loss and what it means to be human. I emerged feeling as if the world around me had been made anew." So that sounds very much like a lost and a found and an and we'll end there. Catherine, thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Catherine Schulz's new book is called Lost and Found. Liz Harris joins us now to talk about what's going on in the publishing world. Hey, Liz.
Hi, Pamela. So today we're going to talk about a case that I've been obsessed with for a very long time, which is for years now, someone has been stealing book manuscripts before they're published. And this person did it by basically impersonating people in the publishing world over email. So let's say I'm the thief. So I email you, Pamela, an author, and say, "Hi, Pamela, it's your agent, Liz Harris, and I just am hoping you can send me the latest copy of your manuscript. Thanks so much. Hope you're having a great day." And it's such a relationshipy business, and everyone kind of knows everybody. And manuscripts get shipped around all the time, and a lot of people send him stuff. And he targeted all kinds of authors and all kinds of manuscripts. People like Margaret Atwood or Ethan Hawke, who kind of make sense, right? Like you can see how someone would want those books before they're published. But also debut novelists whose work would have no market value if you were to just dump it on the internet and ask people to pay for it. And then the craziest thing is all of these books, copies of them disappeared, and then nothing ever happened. No ransom notes, nothing ever showed up on the dark web. They just sort of vanished. And it was this crazy thing going on for years and no one could figure it out. And earlier this month, the FBI made an arrest. They have accused a 29-year-old rights coordinator who works at Simon & Schuster named Filippo Bernardini. Simon & Schuster, by the way, has not been accused of any wrongdoing here, and plenty of their authors got hit with this. And the FBI say he impersonated hundreds of people over at least 5 years and stole hundreds of manuscripts. It's fascinating.
So what's next?
He's out on bail, and either he'll go to trial or he'll plead guilty, and we'll see.
All right. This is kind of a fun story. I mean, it's terrible, but it's also kind of a fun story.
It is. It's terrible. It was scary for the authors. You have your early draft floating around in the world and you don't know what's happening with it. People found it creepy to be impersonated, obviously. But, no one lost their livelihood here. No one died. He was accused of breaking laws. But I agree with you that it's also a fun, interesting story.
All right. We can just very quietly say that, but it's also very serious.
Yes, both of those things.
Liz, thank you so much.
Thank you, Pamela.
Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleagues Greg Coles and John Williams. Hey, guys.
Hey, everybody.
Hi, Pamela.
So, John, let's start with you. What have you been reading?
Well, as listeners will know, I have been reading, and I am continuing to read Middlemarch by George Eliot, but that will take me a bit longer. And so in the meantime, in recent years, I've become a real juggler as a reader, and I usually have a few things going. So I've decided to make little tactical tributaries into much smaller, more efficient things. And so I recently read, I'm holding in my hands this novel. It's quite small and appealing in size. It's 116 pages long. Actually, that includes a note on the text. It's 114 pages long. And they're small pages. A short little book called Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan. She is an Irish writer who I have not read before. I think she's mostly written short stories and also another very slender novel or two. And I'm a big fan of Irish writers, and this sounded, in the descriptions I had heard, like it would be up my alley. And it was. It's very lovely. It's one of these very simple, gem-like stories that takes place. You can read it in one sitting, obviously. It's a very self-contained story set in the mid-1980s in a small Irish town. And there's a coal merchant there who works with lumber and other things named Bill. And while he's making an order to a convent one day, he discovers, not that it would be a spoiler, but I won't get too specific, but essentially he discovers that the convent is keeping girls there who have been, as you would say in last century, in trouble or are pregnant. And there's a specific name for these places in Ireland. They're called Magdalen laundries. And there's a long history of them. And there's been in recent decades, a lot of discovery about what some of them did. And they were not pleasant places often. And Bill essentially discovers this and has to make a decision about whether or not he's going to help one of the girls who's there. And that's it. I mean, it's very spare. The writing is quite beautiful. It's not quite lyrical. It's very chiseled away. I can't say that I didn't quite rise to the level of, say, William Maxwell, another writer who I know that, Pamela, you also admire, who works in that kind of mode of very plain spoken and gets his emotional rewards from not very labyrinthine stories or prose. And so I would recommend this book. I can't say that it's, as a hardcover book, it's almost gift-shaped. It's so small that it almost reads like a longer short story. But I will definitely be checking out more of her work. I don't know how widely she's been published here, but I know several of her collections and other books are available from the UK, so I'll have to investigate that. Greg, what have you been reading?
Well, partly inspired by you, John, and your reading of Middlemarch. As I hinted on Twitter last week, I'm diving into one of those quote-unquote project books that I tend to reserve for the new year, like a diet or an exercise regime. I am starting Roberto Bolaño's monumental novel 2666, which is famously based on the femicides that plagued Ciudad Juarez in Mexico in the 1990s and 2000s, and that I believe continue even to this day. But Bolaño gets there in his typically roundabout fashion. The book is divided into 5 sections, which each have casual names like the title of a Friends episode or Always Sunny in Philadelphia. It's the part about the critics, the part about fate, the part about the crimes. I'm still in the first section, the part about the critics, and I love it. It's beyond me how I've waited so long to read this book. I've really loved all of the other Bolaño I've read, maybe The Savage Detectives especially. And in the early going, this novel has a lot in common with that one, in that it brings together a group of these kind of haunted, eccentric misfits united by their love of literature. And in this case, the misfits are European literary critics and professors. There's one from France and Italy and Spain and one from England. And they're all bound together by their work on this prolific but elusive and little-known German novelist who has an absurd name. It's Benno von Archimboldi, which may not be his real name, and he may not even exist. It's classic Bolaño. It's where he always puts me in mind of somebody like Borges, which is a comparison other people have made, or Nabokov in his kind of the fussy academics that Nabokov writes about. Bolaño loves literature, but he loves it skeptically. He worries that it can't really shoulder the burden of capturing all of life's beauty and squalor and injustice and glory, but it's all that he has, so he'll try.
Greg, am I remembering correctly from Twitter? Do you have the very cool multi-volume edition of this novel?
I do. I should say that the paperback edition I'm reading, which FSG has conveniently split into a 3-volume boxed set, so it's a little less daunting. It's translated by the wonderful Natasha Wimmer, who also translated The Savage Detectives, and she's one of Bolaño's principal translators into English, along with a guy named Chris Andrews, who translated the short feverish novel By Night in Chile and the story collection Last Evenings on Earth, and a lot else. Bolaño was as prolific as Benno von Archimboldi. And for a time anyway, just as obscure and mysterious. It's one of the more autobiographical and prophetic themes that his work gets at, which is the changing fortunes and fashions of art through time. It puts me in mind of something that Chris Andrews said about Bolaño in an interview once, which is appropriate here, since I've waited so long to read 2666. I don't think it's ever really urgent to read the book that everyone's talking about. If it's good, it will still be good in a few years' time, and hopefully in many years' time as well. Readers who think like that will go on discovering Bolaño when he's old news.
Have you read Bolaño?
I read about a third of The Savage Detectives and was loving it, but it's I think Greg can back me up on this. It gets very dense in its imaginings and in the cast of characters, and I think I got either pulled away for work and it became too daunting to go back to it, but I've always meant to go back and start again from the beginning because I really was loving it. And 2666 is something that I have a 1-volume paperback of it, so I'm a little jealous of Greg's now in the slipcase, but I will get to it eventually. And it'll be interesting to talk to Greg in the coming weeks because, famously the most difficult / analyzed section of the book is this incredibly long recounting of the femicides. And I'll be curious to see what Greg makes of that.
I have no idea at this point how he'll work it around to the femicides eventually, which is called the part about the crimes, but I'm all in for the journey to find out.
Because right now, the way you're describing it, it's kind of funny. I didn't realize that the first part was it sounds very redolent of The Savage Detectives and very much in that vein.
And a lot of his other work.
But the other thing you're reminding me of when you said it took you a long time to get to it was there's this hilarious video of Mary Gateskill online. It was walking around a Brooklyn bookstore for 3 or 4 minutes and just picking things up and saying what she thinks about them. And at one point, this is probably from 10 years ago at this point, she picks up a Bolaño novel and she says, I haven't gotten around to reading Bolaño yet. I just can't because, all these people, when you see them at parties and things, they say so pretentiously like, oh, have you read Bolaño.
Actually, something that you said, John, got me thinking about books that you start and get like a really good chunk into and then give up for one reason or another. And then it just feels, speaking of daunting, it just feels like how and when will I ever get back into that thing? I almost feel like I could fill up a shelf on my bookshelves of books that I've like made a good headway into. And then, like, I remember I did that with War and Peace originally. And, you know, speaking of a large cast of characters, I just felt at sea after a while. And I dropped it for about 10 years.
I did that with Bring Up the Bodies, the Hilary Mantel.
I did it with Wolf Hall.
I'm sorry. Wolf Hall is what I mean, actually. I read the first 30 to 50 pages of that about 10 times before I pushed through.
With War and Peace, the next volume that I got had actually a family tree. You know, it had the whole cast of characters in the front of the book, which was very helpful when I picked it back up. But the thing with the Hilary Mantel for me is I read the first volume, and then now it's too much time has gone by. Like I would have to reread Wolf Hall if I were to go back and read Bring Up the Bodies.
It's funny. We should make a list for each other of all the books that fall into that category because it is an interesting grouping. And Pamela, last week you, I hope, teasingly made fun of me for reading short books. It's okay. but I think that might be one reason is that, you know, with our jobs, it is the one thing it is hard to do is not get pulled away eventually by something that you sort of have to do. And so the 800-page monsters really become difficult.
I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, the book I first picked up, I'm pretty sure, was Ian Fraser's In Siberia, because my initial thought was, I want to be any place but here. And then after a while of reading In Siberia, which I really love, I was like, yeah, but I also don't want to be in Siberia. And so I put it down, and now it goes onto that bookshelf of books I was enjoying, but I just I don't know when I'm going to get back into them.
Sometimes that's enough.
Sometimes it is enough. I think that my version of Middlemarch doesn't have that character tree in the front of it that you're talking about, Pamela. And I could actually really use one. I should look one up online because I do get away from it for a few days. And when I go back, it's sometimes hard to remember all the relationships between people.
Yes.
But what are you reading these days, Pamela? Anything that requires a huge genealogy?
Well, it's funny. So the book I am actually reading, and I'm not going to talk about it for a few weeks, is Our Mutual Friend by Dickens, which does have an enormous cast of characters. And you do find, or at least I find myself flipping back and being like, wait a minute, is Mr. Julius, whatever his name is, the same person as Mr. Rokesmith? And what did I miss in that very early passage? But I'll talk about that later. I'm going to talk instead about a book I read at the beginning of December during that very brief shard of time when you could travel without risking immediate infection. And I was going to Paris and The Hague, and I thought it would be fitting to read the latest Prix Goncourt winner that had been translated into English. And conveniently, there was a copy in the office. So I grabbed The Anomaly by Hervé Letellier. And just a couple things. One is I didn't know at all what the book was about.
Airplane reading.
Well, it actually is not airplane reading. And I think you edited Sarah Lyle's review, Greg, didn't you?
No, I did.
You did. So, you know, it's really not what you should be reading on the airplane. And I very ignorantly posted something on Instagram like, it's for the flight. And of course, some people I'm sure thought that was a very dark comment, but it was merely an ignorant one. And as those of you who've read something about it know, it's about a big cast of characters, rotating narratives. And these are all people who get onto a plane and something very bad happens on that flight. So it really is not what you should read on the plane. And also, I made the mistake of, I saw Sarah Lyle's review and I didn't read it knowing that I was going to read this novel and I wanted to come at it really knowing nothing. But my eye alighted on just one phrase in her review, and that was a passage that said, you don't even find out what happens on the plane until page 151. It was very precise. Our colleague Liz Egan did this to me once about a TV show. She said, something's coming up in a couple of seasons that you're really not going to like. And I mean, and then, you know, and she raced through it. I'm the one that told her to watch this TV show. She raced through the entire thing well ahead of me. And then I could only watch waiting for that thing, you know, to happen. And of course, it didn't happen until like season 5. So it was similar with this because I was on vacation. I wasn't reading very quickly and I was mostly sleeping on the plane. So it took me a while to get to page 151. All that said, it's a thriller, but it's a thinky, intellectual, philosophical thriller Somewhat along the lines, I thought Sarah Lyle nailed it in her review when she compared it to Ted Chiang. There are ideas behind the big twists that are worth thinking about. And your enjoyment of the novel might depend on your appetite for that kind of like very French thinkiness added onto what's otherwise a page-turning thriller. But I liked it. So that's what I read.
Oh, that's great. Once you said you were reading that, I kind of perked up because I was really curious to hear what you thought of it. Sarah's review made me interested in it.
It is worth reading. You never read thrillers, John, right?
I guess not. Not page-turnery ones.
You like Anita Bruckner, Nothing Happens kind of books more, I feel.
Well, those are my bread and butter. Yeah. I mean, I'll mix things up with a mystery sometimes. I read sometimes Lawrence Block and people like that.
It's a thriller that won the Prix Goncourt.
Right. Let's not take away its bona fides.
Right. We all read pretentious international literature of one stripe or another this week.
Exactly.
Let's go down the list quickly. John?
Yeah, I read Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan.
I'm reading 2666 by Roberto Bolaño.
And I read The Anomaly by Hervé Letellier. Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.